Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday, Yom Rishon. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Sunday? Yehud in South Carolina, Shandor in the Bronx, Bill in mid-Missouri. As someone whose family raised goats when I was a child, I suspect today's daf, going off the title, is going to be highly interesting. I agree. Bella in Florida, Sharon in New Jersey, Lorraine in Texas, Randy in Florida, Melissa in Great Neck, Karen in Northern California, Lucy in Minnesota, Joe in the Inland Empire, Joseph is in Reno, Nevada on the road, Marjorie in Georgia, Penelope Oppenheimer in Anaheim. I don't know, there's something just beautiful about your name. Penelope Oppenheimer in Anaheim. Welcome, Penelope. Chaim in Florida, Aoife in Florida, Guy in Ohio. Welcome, everybody. Let's get to it. I just want to share with the class, because I really feel it's the merit of the class, not of me. But I got a message today, and then we had a subsequent phone conversation with a rabbi, Satmar rabbi in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, named Elimelech Friedman, who teaches a very popular Daf Yomi shiur, Daf Yomi class. It's distributed on Torah Anytime and All Daf. He teaches in Yiddish. I wish I spoke Yiddish. But, you know, full-on Satmar. Streimel, big beard, etc., and he came across one of my jokes. So first of all, if you're not hearing Sal doing greatest Jewish jokes of all time, you can find those on our website, Accidental Talmudist, on the AT app, which you should have by now, and especially on Instagram and TikTok. I know this Satmar rabbi is not on TikTok. I think he might be on Instagram, but even more than that, the jokes just get passed around on WhatsApp. So he discovered me from the Jewish jokes, and he liked that. And then he realized that I'm also teaching Daf Yomi. He was very intrigued, and he went and listened to last night's shiur, our class last night, and he said he was very impressed, and that we're doing a great job together here learning. And that my class should be on All Daf and Torah Anytime. So maybe we'll, reach out to those folks and see if we can get it on. I always felt like, who am I to be alongside, great rabbis? I mean, they're really famous rabbis on All Daf. I'm just, humbly doing the best that I can. But we do fill an important niche, right? Because I don't teach in yeshivish, which all the other rabbis on All Daf and Torah Anytime they do. They just assume that their listener has already been studying Gemara for a long time, and they speak in that jargon known as yeshivish, where they just liberally mix in Hebrew words, Aramaic words, even Yiddish words, and it's just assumed that everybody understands. But when I first started doing Daf Yomi in 2005, and I went to a shiur that was being taught in yeshivish, I just couldn't follow it, So I feel it's important that we have a class in plain English, so we don't dumb it down, but it's accessible to anybody who speaks English. And that's the niche that we fill. But at any rate, it was a really nice compliment. We had a great conversation. And I just feel like that's really a compliment and a testament, not to me, but to our class. So I thought I would pass that along. Okay, our daf today is page 36, Lamed Vav. Here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud. We're working our way through chapter 3, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 1, discussing the ways in which a presumption of ownership, known as a chazaka, is established. Namely, if you use the land for 3 years by residing on it or farming it or otherwise making use of it as it's intending to be used, and nobody objects, so then that person is presumed to be the legal owner. And if the prior owner comes and says, what are you talking about? I never sold him that land. He's going to have to prove it if he didn't lodge a protest during those 3 years. Continuing a few paragraphs from the top on page 35b. The Mishnah teaches with regard to certain types of property that their presumptive ownership, their chazaka, is established by use of a duration of 3 years from day to day, right? Daily use for 3 years. Now, the Gemara comments that Rabbi Abba says, nevertheless, there are cases where presumptive ownership is established immediately. For example, if the prior owner himself lifted a basket of fruit from that field for the possessor, that immediately is sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership, and the prior owner can no longer lodge a protest. In other words, if in front of witnesses, the prior owner acted in a way that made it obvious that he was conceding ownership of the land to this other person, well then witnesses come and testify that, so it's obvious that the ownership has been transferred, then we don't have to wait 3 years. Because of that act by the prior owner, like loading produce into the wagon of the new owner, handing him materials in such a way that it's clear that the ownership has passed from the prior owner to the new owner, then the presumption of ownership has now passed to the new owner. It doesn't mean that he can't be dislodged if in fact that action, had some other explanation and there's paperwork to the contrary, etc. There's all kinds of other evidence that we could bring to bear. But the presumption of ownership is with the new owner, and to dislodge him, further evidence will have to be brought. Rav Zevid says, but if the prior owner stated a claim and said, I brought him down into my field solely to consume the produce, for example, as a sharecropper. I didn't sell the field to him. I hired him to be a sharecropper on my land. Or I sold him the right to produce of that field for a certain number of years. Okay, so that's not selling him the field, but as a result, I might have loaded, the produce onto his wagon in a way that looks like I sold him the field. So this is the one kind of explanation that will dislodge the presumption of ownership. If, I loaded produce for him, but it's because I sold him the produce of the field, not the field. That would be the kind of further evidence that would dislodge the presumption of ownership. So he would be deemed credible if he made if he told that story. And that law, that the prior owner is deemed credible, were he to state such a claim that he sold a right to produce rather than the field itself, this applies only if he stated it within 3 years of when the other took possession. But after 3 years, he is no longer deemed credible to make that claim. Rav Ashi said to Rav Kahana, if in fact he did bring him down into the field solely to consume the produce, what was there for him to do to prevent the possessor from establishing the presumption of ownership? And Rav Kahana said to him, he should have protested during the first 3 years and publicized that he had granted the possessor rights to the produce alone. Again, remember, all of these litigations that we're talking about, all of these disputes that we're talking about, all of these needs for a presumption of ownership that we have been discussing are in the context of the purchase and sale, either of the field itself or of the right to produce, wasn't ratified properly with documentation and witnesses. If they did it properly, none of these cases would come up. But because sometimes people do the document properly and lose the document, or they don't document it properly, there was a flaw in the documentation, there were strange circumstances, like it was wartime, Jews were being persecuted, etc., then we have this need for the presumption of ownership as one of the big evidence points. Particularly, presumption of ownership shifts the burden from the one who is on the field claiming that he bought it legally. Now the burden is shifted to the one who comes and says, hey, that's my field that you've been occupying. He's going to have to prove it if the one occupying has been there for 3 years, taking benefit from the land. That's important, as we shall see momentarily. Now, in this case where you just sold the rights to produce, and you just let the guy farm your land for 3 years, and you never publicize the fact that you sold only the right to produce rather than the field itself, somebody should have given you better advice. You should have made it clear to the neighbors that this guy living on your land and farming it had a right to produce and not to the land itself, because you've created a danger that he could say at the end of the 3 years, hey, I bought it and I've been here for 3 years. Prove that I didn't buy it. Right? That would be the problem. Now, the assumption that lodging a protest would be effective must be correct. Since if you do not say so, then in the case of this mortgage, according to the custom of Sura, right? So in Sura, a place in Bava, in the Babylonian Jewish community within the Persian Empire, there was a particular kind of legal device used. So this was a loan of money that would then be paid off by the lender taking over the field of the borrower and farming it, right? Utilizing that land for a certain number of years until the loan is paid off. Now, what's tricky about this kind of a loan is, well, if he ends up consuming more produce than the loan was worth, then doesn't this take on the appearance of interest, right? Because it's prohibited for a Jew to lend money to another Jew and take interest on that loan. Now, on the one hand, you could just say, well, no, he's just going to consume produce until the exact value of the loan has been paid off, and then he leaves. So there's no interest issue. Or a different way of doing it, which seems to be what they did in Sura, is that it wasn't a loan at all. It was really an investment. And what he was purchasing was a number of crop years for a certain amount of money. Since he's taking a risk that those crop years could be very fertile and worth more than the amount of money paid for it, or that not so much rain would come, or some pestilence would set in, and he would end up getting less than the value of the loan, since he's undertaking the risk both for the profit, greater profit, or greater loss than the money paid for it. It's not really a loan at all. It's an investment, so there's not an interest problem. Now, the way that intersects with our discussion today is, okay, but either way, he paid some money, and now he's going to be farming that land possibly for more than 3 years. Won't that look to an outsider like somebody bought the land and has been using it for 3 years? And that could create a presumption of ownership that would end up, booting the original owner unless it was known that it was this kind of arrangement and not a purchase and sale. So, at the completion of these years of this kind of arrangement in Sura, at the completion of these years, this land will be released to its prior owner without any need for the prior owner to give money. If the creditor were to hide the mortgage document in his possession and say, this land is purchased and that is why it is in my possession, here is it also the case that he would be deemed credible? That cannot be, as it is reasonable that the sages would institute a matter such as this type of arrangement, that people can be led to suffer a loss. In other words, would the sages institute a type of loan/investment where it could be exploited by the lender and take advantage of the prior owner of the land and seize his land without actually buying the land, but rather just paying for some crop years and end up taking the land because he was there for 3 years? The sages would never create such a device that could be exploited that way. So rather, in the case of the mortgage, the debtor should have protested. And by not protesting, he causes his own loss. And here too, in the case of the field, the owner should have protested. In other words, the sages didn't create a system that could be easily exploited. And as long as the one who sells these crop years, whether you call it a loan or an investment, he just has to make sure that the neighbors know what he's doing, that this guy who's coming in to farm his land, it's because he bought the right to those years, or he's using the produce to pay off a loan, but he didn't purchase the field. This guy just has to make sure that people know that, and then there's no risk that he'll end up losing the field. New subject. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, with regard to a Jew who comes to claim land, due to having received it from a Gentile, He is like a Gentile in terms of which legal claims are available to him. Therefore, just as a Gentile has the ability to establish the presumption of ownership only by means of a document, so too a Jew who comes to claim land due to having received it from a Gentile has the ability to establish the presumption of ownership only by means of a document. Okay, so underlying this is what? What's the assumption here? We've just been talking, for days about the idea that a Jew sold another Jew a piece of property and it wasn't documented properly, but the new owner then occupied that piece of land, whether it was a residence or he rented it out for his own benefit, or it was a field that he farmed, or a vineyard that he harvested the grapes, or an orchard, etc. And he was there for 3 years. So now the new owner has a presumption of ownership, and if the prior owner wants to dislodge him and say, I never sold you that land, he's going to have to prove it. In the absence of such proof, the new owner keeps the land because he occupied it for 3 years. And now we're hearing that presumption of ownership, we don't extend that legal device to a Gentile who bought land from a Jew. Why? Answer, because so many times in Jewish history, and particularly when these laws were coming, were being expounded and promulgated, Jews were being persecuted harshly by the Roman Empire, and the Roman might step in and push off the Jew. And the Jew is terrified to push the Roman back off the land, because if he does so, he and his family might be killed, right? The same thing would have happened, in the 1800s in Poland, or the Pale of Settlement, Ukraine, Eastern Europe, Russia, where the local poritz, the local noble, has so much power over the Jewish community that you can't say that the Jew failed to protest because the land actually belonged to the Gentile. Maybe he failed to protest because he was in fear of his life. And so that he just let the Gentile keep using the land, hoping that eventually the Gentile would go away and then he could reclaim his land. So the failure to protest against the Gentile occupying the land is not because the Gentile legitimately owned the land, but because of this fear of confronting, somebody who might kill you and your family. Therefore, if a Gentile, had a possession of the land and he sold it to another Jew, then that Jew who bought it from the Gentile, he does not get the benefit of the presumption of ownership if he's there for 3 years, because he bought it from a Gentile. And like the Gentile, in order to establish legal ownership, he's going to have to show not 3 years of consecutive possession of the land, but rather the original deed of sale. He has to present the document by which he purchased the land, presumably with witnesses to that purchase and sale. The Gentile's going to have that in order to establish clear title to the land. And a Jew who buys land that previously belonged to a Jew and then went into the possession of a Gentile, the Jew will also have to show the document, right? That he bought it legally from the Gentile, and that the Gentile legally bought it from the previous Jewish owner. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go back. Rabbi Yehuda says that Rav says, with regard to a Jew who comes to claim land due to having received it from a Gentile, he is like the Gentile in terms of which legal claims are available to him. Therefore, just as the Gentile can establish presumption of ownership only by means of a document, so too the Jew who comes to claim land due to having received it from a Gentile has the ability to establish the presumption of ownership only by means of a document. Rava said, and if the Jew said to a prior owner who claims to still own the land, that the Gentile told me that he purchased the field from you, this claim is deemed credible. And the Gemara asks, is there any case where if a Gentile says a matter, he is not deemed credible, but if a Jew said it in the Gentile's name, he would be deemed credible? This outcome doesn't seem right. So rather, Rava said, and we are on page 36a, Rava said, if a Jew said to the prior owner, a Gentile purchased a field from you in my presence, and then he sold it to me, This claim is deemed credible, since if he wanted to, he could have said to the prior owner of the land, I purchased it from you, and he would be believed if he had all the other evidence in line, since he made the weaker claim of the Gentile purchased it from you in my presence, and then he sold it to me, he is deemed credible. Now the Gemara records a series of laws pertaining to presumptive ownership. And Rabbi Yehuda says, this one who is holding a sickle and rope and says, I will go cull the dates from the date tree of so-and-so from whom I purchased it, he is deemed credible. And the reason for this is that a person is not so brazen that he would go cull the dates from a date tree that is not his, or that he doesn't have the right to cull. And Rabbi Yehuda also says, with regard to this one who possesses a field only from the fence built to prevent the entry of the wild donkeys and outward toward the public property, this conduct is not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. And what is the reason? The owner says to himself, everything that this guy sows, right, plants, hoping to raise a crop, the wild donkeys will eat it. And so he cannot establish the presumption of ownership for him, as he is not profiting from the land as an owner would. So this is important when we say that one establishes a presumption of ownership by benefiting from the land, he has to actually benefit from the land. So here we're talking about somebody has a large piece of land, and he puts up a fence not right on the property line, but in a little bit inland of that, right? So let's say that he leaves a strip, 30 feet wide, between the actual edge of his land and his fence. And this fence is meant to keep the wild donkeys out of his field. And I guess why didn't he put it on the edge of his land? I don't know. Maybe he just wanted a border. He wanted to allow, bushes to grow, which will help repel the wild donkeys. For whatever reason, he put up a fence, about 30 feet from the edge of his property. And then somebody comes along and he, clears the brush and plants a field in that 30-foot strip between this guy's fence and the actual border of his property. And then the guy plants there 3 years in a row. Does he now have a presumption of ownership? Answer, no, because it's such a bad risk to plant in a place where the wild donkeys are going to come and consume the produce, that the owner doesn't even bother to object, because he's like, well, this guy's not going to have a successful crop. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. I won't bother to protest, but it's not that he is ceding, C-E-D-I-N-G, giving away the rights to that strip of land outside his fence meant to repel wild donkeys, because it's so unlikely that anyone who plants there will actually benefit from it. And a third ruling of Rabbi Yehuda, with regard to one who profited from the land by consuming produce from the first 3 years after it was planted. So this is Orla, right? When you're talking about fruit trees, when you plant them for the first 3 years, the produce of those trees is prohibited. That's Orla. It says a law in the Torah. We can't eat the fruit of fruit trees during the first 3 years of growth. Fourth year fruit is supposed to be brought to Jerusalem when the temple is standing, and then we begin to benefit from fruit trees in the 5th year. The Orla prohibition, by the way, is still in effect today. So if somebody is consuming that fruit of trees planted in their first 3 years, what he's consuming is prohibited. Is he benefiting from the land? Not really. Because what he's eating, every time he eats that fruit, he's committing a transgression. The transgression outweighs the hunger that maybe that fruit is satisfying. So according to this law, one who consumes Orla, he can't claim that his consumption of that Orla was tantamount to benefiting from the land and establishing a presumption of ownership after he did that for 3 years. Now, not all opinions are unanimous about that. Some will say, yeah, but he did slake his hunger, even though he committed a transgression. He also benefited, and that could be used for a presumption of ownership, because ownership law is not the same as, is this a righteous Jew, who isn't sinning? Those are different questions. One who's consuming orla shouldn't be consuming orla, but did he establish a presumption of ownership? According to some opinions, yes. According to other opinions, no. And this also applies to other kinds of prohibited produce with regard to orla and consuming produce of the sabbatical year, or if he consumed produce that was prohibited because of kilayim, right? Diverse kinds like wheat being grown within a vineyard, which is prohibited. Again, we would have this same problem. Most opinions would say he did not establish presumption of ownership because he was eating something prohibited. Some say he does establish. Rav Yosef says, with regard to one who profited from the land by consuming fodder, i.e. produce that has grown stalks but is not yet ripe, this conduct is not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. Rava said, but if the land was located in the neck of Mechoza, which is a valley where it was common to harvest unripe produce in order to feed animals, then this conduct is sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership because, okay, he's consuming unripe produce, but he's using it to feed his animals. He clearly benefited from it. Rav Nachman says consumption of produce of land that is fissured, 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 is not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. And this is due to the fact that produce does not grow well there, and therefore owners do not bother to protest if a trespasser uses the land. Therefore, their silence should not be understood as an admission that it belongs to the possessor. That's why they didn't lodge a protest. Doesn't mean that the uninterrupted use of the land established ownership of the land. Similarly, consumption of produce of land where one expends a core of seed, core, K-O-R, a certain volume of seed, in order to sow and plant in that field, and what does he get for it? In the end, he harvests a core of seed, right? In other words, the amount of seed that he used to plant the field is equal to what he ended up harvesting from it, plus all the work that he put in to do it. That's not a productive field, right? Because the labor and materials is greater than what you actually harvest from it. So it's not a productive field, and therefore, even if you do farm it for 3 years in this unproductive manner, you don't establish a presumption of ownership. Rav Nachman continues, and these members of the household of the exilarch, the leader of the Jewish community in Bava, right, the Jewish community in the Persian Empire, in the area known as Babylonia. And the exilarch, this was a very wealthy and powerful family that had a good relationship with the king of Persia in most generations. And because they had so much power, other people were not so quick to challenge them, right? And these members of the household of the exilarch do not establish the presumption of ownership in our land, as people are afraid to lodge a protest against them. And we do not establish the presumption of ownership in their land, as, due to their wealth, they might not lodge a protest against one who trespasses on their land. They own so much land that they might not even notice if somebody starts farming on their land for a few years. Doesn't mean that we can establish that presumption of ownership because these people own so much they didn't notice. And because they didn't notice, they didn't lodge a protest. Therefore, we can't say that the failure to lodge a protest means that they concede that the land is owned by the one in possession of it. New subject, the Mishna teaches, and of slaves. Presumption of ownership of them is established by using them for a duration of 3 years from day to day. Thank God we don't live in a time when slavery is legal, hasn't been for millennia. But when slavery was practiced, ownership of slaves for many areas of the law was likened to ownership of land, ownership of real property, and in the same way that land could be inherited, slaves could be inherited, there's a lot of similarities. So, just like you can occupy land for 3 years, and if the previous owner doesn't protest, we presume that he sold it to the one in possession of it. Likewise, if somebody has a slave working for him for 3 years, it must be that he legally purchased that slave, and the slave is his. And the Gemara asks, but with regard to slaves, is there presumptive ownership of them? But doesn't Reish Lakish say, with regard to livestock, possession of them does not establish the presumption of ownership, since livestock wander from place to place. Therefore, one cannot claim that his mere possession of livestock demonstrates ownership, as one can with regard to other movable items, because it may have wandered onto his property on its own. And the same law should apply with regard to a slave. All the more so, slaves can walk about, and go where they want to go, just like livestock does. And Rava said it is true that possession of them does not establish the presumption of ownership immediately. But there is presumptive ownership of them after 3 years. If the slave was working for this guy for 3 years, if he had some owner somewhere that didn't, try to bring him back, it must be because he sold the slave. And so using the slave, owning the slave, and working him for 3 years does establish ownership, the presumption of ownership. Rava said, if the slave in question was a small child placed in a cradle, possession of him does establish the presumption of ownership immediately, as it does with regard to other movable items. And the Gemara says, well, isn't that obvious, since the baby cannot move on its own? And the Gemara answers, no, it is necessary to state this in a case where the slave baby, has a mother. Lest you say one should be concerned that perhaps his mother brought him up to there, and his being on another person's property does not indicate that the latter is his master. Therefore, Rava teaches us that there is no concern about this possibility, since a mother does not forget her son. Therefore, possession of the infant slave does establish the presumption of ownership. If he has that baby in his possession, it's probably because he bought the mother or he bought the slave child, etc. The Gemara relates, there were these certain goats that ate peeled barley, known as chushala, in Nehardea, the city of Nehardea in Bava. So the owner of the peeled barley came and seized the goats. And he was claiming a large sum of money for the barley from the owner of the goats, right? So some guy has a field where this high quality barley is growing or has been stacked, and goats came over and started eating it. Now, I don't know much about goats, but I know that goats have a big appetite and they'll eat anything, right? So it might well happen that, let's say, peeled barley sounds to me like harvested barley that's already been processed, making it much more valuable. And there was a big pile of it, and the goats wandered onto this guy's land from his neighbor and ate this big pile of produce that was worth a lot of money, right? So now he wants to get paid, and to make sure he gets paid, he seizes the goats, right? He's seizing the goats as collateral to make sure he gets paid for what the goats ate. Okay, seems reasonable. So Shmuel's father, who was also a sage, Shmuel's father said he is able to claim up to the value of the goats, since if he wants to, he could say the goats are purchased and that is why they are in my possession. The Gemara asks, but doesn't Reish Lakish say with regard to livestock, possession of them does not establish the presumption of ownership? And the Gemara answers, goats are different, as they are given to shepherds and do not wander on their own. Why are they given to shepherds and do not wander on their own? Because they might easily wander off on their own and do so much damage. Therefore, their owners have to make sure that the goats are being watched by shepherds so that they don't do this kind of damage. Therefore, the fact that they're on your land never means that you could make a presumption of ownership on them like you could with other livestock. But, so in other words, in this case, the guy doesn't have available to him the argument that he could claim the goats are his, as Shmuel said, and therefore the only amount that he could claim as damages is up to the value of the goats themselves. It's interesting that the goats might have eaten more than they are worth in themselves. But it sounds like we're rejecting Shmuel's argument, and this guy can claim as much as he lost, and he's just holding the goats to get that payment. The Gemara challenges this. But there is morning and evening to consider, when the goats are not supervised, when they are traveling between the owner and the shepherd. And during these times, the law of livestock should apply with regard to them. And the Gemara explains the case under discussion took place in Nehardea. And in Nehardea, there are certain Arabs who steal animals. Very commonplace incident in Nehardea that these particular Arabs steal livestock. And therefore, because of this danger, the goats there are delivered from hand to hand, and they are never left unsupervised. So the guy can't make this argument that I could have claimed the goats are mine, and therefore I'm not. So believe me when I say you owe me this much. That argument is not available to him, but he can certainly get paid for all the produce that the goats ate. Now, the Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Yishmael says 3 months of possession in the first year. Now we're back to our Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 3. And this was the minority opinion. The majority opinion was that somebody has to occupy land for 3 whole years, 3 complete years, in order to get the benefit of the presumption of ownership, which means that the burden of proof has been shifted to the one who comes and claims, hey, that land is mine, I never sold it to you. He's going to have to prove it because this other guy's been there for 3 years. The minority opinion, and it was a little bit different between Rabbi Yishmael's minority opinion and Rabbi Akiva's minority opinion, was that less time than 3 years will suffice, namely a certain amount of time of the first year, just a portion of it, the whole middle year, and a certain amount of time in the third year will count like 3 years. And how so? The Mishnah taught that Rabbi Yishmael says 3 months of possession in the first year, 3 months of possession in the third year, and the whole middle year, which is 18 months total. This suffices to establish the presumption of ownership. Rabbi Akiva disagrees and says that 1 month in the first year and 1 month in the third year, plus the entire middle year, is sufficient for a total of 14 months. So the Gemara asks, shall we say that the difference between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva is whether plowing the land is sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership? As Rabbi Yishmael holds that plowing is not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership, and 3 months are needed for the crop to grow. And Rabbi Akiva holds that plowing is enough. It's enough to just plow the field. You're showing that you want the benefit of that field, and that can be accomplished in 1 month. And the Gemara asks, and how can you understand their opinions this way? If so, according to Rabbi Akiva, why specifically require a whole month? Plowing only takes a few days. Now we're on page 36b. Even if he plowed the land for 1 day in the first and third years respectively, it should be sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. Rather, everyone agrees that plowing is not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. And here the difference between their opinions is whether in order to establish the presumption of ownership, one needs to possess the land long enough to grow major produce, which requires 3 months to grow, or only minor produce, which requires 1 month to grow. Now, the sages taught in a Baraisa, plowing is not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. The fact that he plowed the field is not enough to be equal to a whole year of being on that land, because there's other reasons why somebody might plow a field that is not because he believes and everyone believes that he owns it. And there are those who say that plowing is sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. Whose opinion is that the Baraisa refers to as? There are those who say, Rav Chisda said, this is the opinion of Rabbi Acha, as it is taught in a Baraisa, if the possessor of the field plowed the field for a year, and he sowed it, right, planted seeds, for 2 years, or if he plowed it for 2 years and sowed it for 1 year, it is not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. But Rabbi Acha says it is sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership, which indicates that Rabbi Acha holds that plowing establishes the presumption of ownership. Rav Ashi said, I asked all of the great men of the generation about this, and they said to me, with regard to plowing, this is sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. Rav Bava said to Rav Nachman, what is the reason of the one who says that plowing is sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership? And Rav Nachman answered, a person is not apt to have his land plowed by someone else and remain silent. If you're the owner of the field and you come out your door in the morning or ride by your field in the afternoon and you see somebody else plowing your field, you'd find that strange. Why is that guy plowing my field? You would investigate and protest that, hey, this is not your field, this is my field, right? So who watches somebody else plow his field, out of the blue, without some kind of sharecropper arrangement or sale of crop years arrangement or sale of the land arrangement? Just, I think I own my field and suddenly somebody else is plowing it, I would speak up. That's what he's saying. Right, that's what that Rav Ashi said, that the great men of the generation told him that they heard that Rav Bava said to Rav Nachman, what is the reason of the one who said that plowing is sufficient? Because a person is not apt to have his land plowed by someone and remain silent. Rav Bava asked, and what is the reason of the one who says that plowing is not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership? Rav Nachman answered, the owner says to himself, let each and every clump of earth enter the plow. That is to say, the owner is amenable to having someone else plow the land for him, and then he will sow and harvest. So either, he hired somebody to plow it for him, obviously, but that would not, why should he object? He hired him. But what they're saying is interesting, right? What if you're watching your field and you see somebody else is plowing it, and you think to yourself, does that guy think this is his field? And that's why he's plowing it? Well, he's going to be in for a rude awakening. But I might as well let him finish the job because it's a convenience to me. Now, you can say, that's not very ethical, but he hasn't ceded his right. He hasn't given away his ownership of the field if he has that thought process. Maybe he should have said something. He didn't say something. But we can't say that the failure to say something is because he gives up the ownership of the field. The residents of Pum Nahara sent a question to Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda. Our teacher, instruct us. Is plowing sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership, or is it not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership? And Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda said to them, Rabbi Acha and all the great men of the generation say, with regard to plowing, this is sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. Rav Nachman bar Yitzhak said, is it a novelty to enumerate great men who maintain an opinion without taking into account that of other great men? But what of Rav and Shmuel in Babylonia and Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Kiva in Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, who say plowing is not sufficient to establish a presumption of ownership? Okay, there's some great guys who say it is. But what about all the greats who say it's not? How can you just say that the law has changed? So the Gemara presents the sources for ascribing to these sages the opinion that plowing does not establish the presumption of ownership. The basis for ascribing this opinion that plowing does not establish ownership to Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva is the Mishna. As the Gemara explained above, mere plowing wasn't enough. You need to plant a crop in the first and third year. So they don't require a whole 3 years. It's still a more lenient opinion than the majority. But plowing by itself is not sufficient. You need to plow and plant and grow a crop, even though that takes less than a full year. So we learned that in the Mishnah. Now, what is the basis for ascribing this opinion that plowing is not sufficient to establish presumption of ownership? What is the basis for ascribing this opinion to Rav? Well, this is as Rav Yehuda says that Rav says. This ruling that either a month or 3 months is sufficient use for the first and third years is the statement of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. But the rabbis whose opinion is accepted say, with regard to a field, its presumption of ownership is established by 3 years, 3 whole years from day to day, meaning daily use for 3 years. Now, the phrase from day to day serves to exclude what? Does it not serve to exclude plowing, which does not establish the presumption of ownership? That's why we ascribe this opinion to Rav. Now, what about Shmuel? As Rabbi Yehuda says that Shmuel says, this ruling that either a month or 3 months is sufficient use for the first and third years is the statement of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, but the rabbis, whose opinion is accepted, say he does not establish the presumption of ownership until he harvests three date crops, or harvests 3 grape crops, or harvests 3 olive crops. And this indicates that Shmuel holds that plowing does not establish the presumption of ownership. And what is the difference between the opinions of Rav and Shmuel? Abaye said the difference between their opinions is whether 3 harvests of a young date tree, which produce a crop 3 times in 1 year, establishes the presumption of ownership or not. Moving on. The Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Yishmael said, in what case is this statement that 18 months are required to establish the presumption of ownership of a non-irrigated field said? Right, that you can do it in less because the non-irrigated field requires less work. You don't have to make sure that the ditches for the irrigation canals are running well. Non-irrigated field means that there's enough rainfall in that area to water the field, requires a lot less presence of its owner, and that's why we don't require that day-to-day usage in the same way. So now in regards to what was this said? With regard to a white field, this means a grain field. But with regard to an orchard, harvesting 3 different crops suffices. Abaye said, from the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, we infer the proper understanding of a detail of the opinion of the rabbis who disagree with him, and hold that 3 years of harvesting 1 crop is required to establish the presumption of ownership, even with regard to an orchard. If one had 30 trees of one type in a field and they were planted with a density of 10 trees per each area required for sowing 1 sa of seed, known as a base sa, and one consumed the produce of 10 trees in this first year and of another 10 trees in this second year, of another 10 trees in this third year, this is sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. In other words, you had a field and you only used part of it in each of 3 years. Now, the part that you used was sort of geographically all around the field. It's not that you only used geographically a portion of the field. It's that you only used some of the trees in each of the 3 years, but you used some trees of the whole field, spread around the whole field in each of the 3 years. Then even though you didn't harvest from all the trees every year, the fact that you harvested from some of the trees all around that field in each of the 3 years is sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. We are at the top of page 37a. The Gemara explains the inference from the statement of Rabbi Yishmael and how it clarifies the opinion of the rabbis who disagree with him. Didn't Rabbi Yishmael say that harvesting 1 type of fruit is sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership for all of the types of fruit, i.e. for the entire field? Here too, these trees are sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership for those trees, and those trees are sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership for these trees. Now the Gemara notes 2 restrictions to this aforementioned ruling, and this statement applies specifically where the other 20 trees did not produce fruit. But if the other trees produced fruit and he did not consume their fruit, then his conduct is not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership with regard to the other trees. And this principle that consuming the produce of some of the trees each year establishes the presumption of ownership for the entire field applies only if it is the case that the trees are scattered throughout the field. Otherwise, he establishes the presumption of ownership only over the section where the trees are located. So we've definitely gotten a little bit into the weeds there, so to speak. But as always, if you buy a piece of land, if you buy a field, if you buy an orchard, make sure that the purchase and sale is properly recorded in a proper document with proper witnesses, and you won't have to rely on these complex laws to prove your ownership later. Okay, a few comments. Michelle. In laws concerning Jews and Gentiles, what if a Gentile is in process of conversion? Does the law change? No. The law changes when the Gentile becomes a Jew, and then the former Gentile is treated as a Jew in every respect, and it is even prohibited to remind the ger tzedek, right, the righteous Gentile who's now become a Jew. It's prohibited for a Jew to remind him that he wasn't always a Jew. But until he completes the conversion, then we certainly will be very friendly and welcoming. But he's not going to, for legal matters, be treated as a Jew until he completes the conversion. Bill, a sidebar on the problem of establishing ownership by use when the nominal owner was of the house of the exilarch. While it may well be the case that the exilarch and his kinsmen owned so much land that they didn't notice it being farmed by someone else for 3 years, I renew my statement, says Bill, from a few classes ago that I think this is unlikely because people are particular about real estate, especially farmland, where the lower totals of produce generated per year would surely be noticed even if the loss of the land directly was not. And if the exilarch and his kin own so much of that, even this would not tip them off, then as a matter of policy, it is probably better for the health of the community that they be compelled to sell some by eminent domain. I mean, maybe, but this, I think your principle would apply only in a place where they're not leaving fields fallow. They might leave fields fallow, and that might change the calculus of this. But I take your point. People are particular with real estate, but I would also take the point of the sages, right, in Bava, who are making these laws about the house of the exilarch, that they spoke this principle for a reason. So that it would work both ways. We don't use a presumption of ownership on their land, and they don't have a presumption of ownership on our land, just by lack of our protest because they're in that, unequal power position. Joe, I would think that owners of large amounts of properties would have employees whose job it is to assure that their properties are used in a way to ensure a profit and prevent squatters from establishing a foothold onto their lands. And I would agree with you, but there's that great wheel of fortune, so to speak, and people who are wealthy sometimes fall on hard times, and maybe not so hard that they had to sell off their fields, but hard enough that they don't have as many employees to watch their fields for the time of their, reduced circumstances. And so that's where that might come up. And Lucy, if someone leaves the area for a time so that his field is unattended and someone comes and plows, etc., for a couple of years, is the field his? So the answer is, so what you're saying is he left it fallow, he wasn't using it. A couple of years doesn't do it, right? We need 3 years. So basically a squatter comes on and it just uses the land for 3 years, right? And then finally the real owner gets wind of it and objects. Now more than 3 years has passed. So he will be able to dislodge the squatter, but the burden of proof has shifted from the squatter, who would need to prove that he legally owns the land. After 3 years, now the burden of proof is on the original owner. He's going to have to prove that the squatter is illegal. Now, he could bring witnesses that this was his land that he inherited from his ancestors. And, somebody could say, and he never sold that land. I know that he thought that land was his. And maybe he can overcome that burden of proof. But the burden of proof has become his rather than the possessor, if the possessor was there uninterrupted for 3 years. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday at the regular time.